LeadDev. First, thanks, Howell, because your talk was so entertaining that I didn't have time to think about my talk. Great distraction. Yeah, it's fantastic to be back at LeadDev. The first thing I need to do is point out a very minor last-minute change to my talk title for reasons that will hopefully become clear later on. So it was, learning is a core capability of teams. Here's how to measure it. And I'm now going to give you one way to measure it. So first, a very short introduction. I'm Sorrel Harriet. I'm an independent consultant who enables learning in software teams. And I've already had a lovely introduction from Pat, so that's as much as I'm going to say about myself. But please do visit my links or talk to me later if you want to find out more. So in my talk today, I'm going to try to answer these two questions. Why should we measure the learning culture of our teams, and how can we measure it? And perhaps I should point out that when I refer to learning culture, I think what I'm really referring to is learning capability. And by that I mean the set of skills and behaviours that drive continuous improvement and keep us in the funnel of flow where we are our happiest and most creative. I'm annoyed with myself because I did have a made-up diagram that I could have used here, but I left it out. So if you want that, you can see me afterwards. Okay, so before I answer the question, why measure learning culture, I want to set the scene a bit. So in the modern technology era, we need to be able to respond quickly to change. And in response to this need, I've noticed that people are increasingly learning to see organisations as complex adaptive systems made up of people who are also complex adaptive systems. And when people start to look at organisations in this way, they may find that they spend less energy trying to control individual parts in the system and more energy trying to understand how the parts in the system interact and affect the behaviour of the system as a whole. And at that point, they may also think about the environment and the culture and the lived experiences of people in the system. And they may recognise that those are the things that drive the behaviour of the whole system. And I think this gets us to the heart of why we need to be thinking about learning culture. Because whereas in the past, we've tended to use learning and development as a way to control parts in the system, I think we now need learning to be something that the system does for itself. So we need to become enablers of learning. And we need to care less about progressing individuals along predictable pathways, which typically involve boring courses, and more about creating the environment and culture in which people and teams will learn continuously and autonomously. So we need to train our systems to learn. Okay, so now let's assume we're all in agreement that a learning culture, whatever that is exactly, is something we want for our organisations and teams. Why then should we try to measure it? Now, this here is not a qualified statement, I just made it up, but I sometimes wonder if it could be true that learning capability is the only performance metric that really matters. Because if you have a complex adaptive systems view of an organisation, then perhaps all you really need to know about your teams is, are they hardwired to learn continuously? Can they self-correct? Are they resilient against change and uncertainty? And if so, then measuring the learning culture or capability is key. Now, a note on measurement. So measuring anything's hard, as we were discussing on the table talk earlier, and didn't really reach any satisfactory conclusion. Measuring a physical object is hard because there are decisions to be made about how to do it. So measuring something that's abstract and complex is very hard. And coming from an academic background, I figured that the first stage in measuring the abstract should be to create a conceptual model. And the conceptual model I arrived at considers learning culture in terms of these 4 dimensions. So you've got quality of task, social relationships, support for learning, and learner efficacy, all of which drive learning. And from this, I developed a survey consisting of 47 Likert scale questions, which are grouped according to these 4 dimensions. I'm going to dive into each dimension a little bit more closely. So firstly, we've got quality of task. So this is the capacity of the activities and the tasks people do to facilitate their learning. Now, I think it can be associated with other factors linked to learning, like cognitive load, for example, which is a hot topic, and novelty. And it can also tell you something about the wider operating environment and social system. And there are a couple of examples there of statements linked to quality of task. Then we have social relationships, which looks at the quality of people's relationships and interactions on the basis that these can both enhance and inhibit learning at the individual and group levels. And that considers things like psychological safety and inclusion, all of which I'm sure you're familiar with. Next, we've got support for learning. So the questions here consider both practical and material support. So, for example, feedback is a form of practical support, whereas access to learning resources is material support. But it also considers practical support in terms of pastoral and peer support. So, using the example of feedback again, that could come from a manager, but it could also come from people you work with, and ideally it comes from both. And finally, learner efficacy looks at people's confidence and self-regard as learners, as well as their learning behaviours. Hal modelled some excellent learning behaviours earlier. In terms of growing a self-sustaining, team-first learning culture, this dimension I think is particularly important, and it's one that we often fall a little bit short on. I'm going to give you access to the survey in full at the end of the talk. Okay, so now I'm going to assume that we've done the survey, which I have done with 6 teams across 3 organisations now, I think. Now, when it came to working with the survey data, I followed this kind of 3-step process. So first of all, I do some visualisation of the results to look for possible signs of strengths and weaker areas, or areas needing a bit more probing. But bearing in mind that the data sets are very small, so it can't take anything at face value. And then I look at what I'm seeing alongside other qualitative data, which could be from interviews, consultations, or observations of people working. And I might do some light thematic analysis there. And then I use systems thinking to look for patterns and causal relationships. So this is an example of some systems thinking going on at the bottom there. So I've kind of described the survey design and the way that I work with the data. But when might you use this, and where might it lead? Well, I would always use it within a continuous improvement process where the high-level goal is to uplift learning capability of the team or teams. You might recognise this here as an example of a continuous improvement process. And the insights from the survey can help the team to establish their next target condition with respect to their learning. And then you, as the enabler of learning, can empower them to own their next steps. And what might that look like? So some examples I can give you of learning enablement have been things like learning needs discovery workshops, where we've explored collective learning needs of the team and thought about how to address those in a joined-up way. Workshops focusing on specific areas of learning capability, like feedback and reflective practice. Or it could mean coaching individuals and teams to develop healthier habits around learning. And if you want to learn more about any of these kind of initiatives, then again, please speak to me after. So to summarise, measuring the learning culture or capability of your teams can give you a valuable indicator of their capacity to respond to change. And it can also serve as a starting point for uplifting learning capability, which I strongly believe is something we should all be trying to do. And one way to do it is via a survey like the one I've just described. But I'm not saying you should definitely all do it this way. And sorry if that seems like a bit of an anticlimax, given the original slightly overconfident title of the talk. So I'm going to share a couple of things I've learned in the process of measuring learning culture. I'm going to try and do that very quickly because I'm realising I'm out of time. So, surprise, surprise, not everyone likes being measured. Measuring people requires trust, and the context really matters. So this is not academic anymore. I've left academia behind. This is people in their natural habitat with all their baggage, and a survey might not be the appropriate thing to give them right now. Secondly, there is a lot of uncertainty inherent in measurement. So this here, I don't know if anyone can get it, but it's meant to be an allusion to the uncertainty principle, if you know of it. But it's also a reminder that sort of absolutism, so the idea that universal truth or a right answer exists and we just have to be clever about finding it, that philosophy doesn't really work here either. So it's important to use and value the lens of human experience when trying to get a measure of learning capability. So some questions to start you thinking about how you measure learning culture for your context. How would you conceptualize it for your context? And when you have that in mind, what are the questions you could be asking your team about it? What conversations could you be having around learning? Because measuring doesn't have to result in a number or a judgment, but it should always lead to learning. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with a link to tools and research that I've used to create this talk. Thank you very much for listening, and do come and chat with me later. Thank you.